Okay, yeah. Hi everyone. I'm so glad that we're all here for the first episode of a series that we've long been working on. Briefly, maybe a few information on where the reflection series sprung from. So for those that are most familiar with the house's activities, you probably already know that we held an event called Open the Archives last May. And during that event, which I invite you to check online if you are curious, important debates and questions arose on the colonial archives and how the house can embrace a different future. Thank you. So the Zuid-Afrikahuis team here, which I'm part of, thought that it would be a shame to leave this conversation pending and not to see concrete outcomes arise from it. This is how we thought of creating the Reflection series, a series of conversations like the one we're having today on matters that are crucial to the house as well as to the South African, Dutch societies, and beyond. Most of the conversations we're going to have really have a global anchor. Today we will discuss colonial archives, their absences, and how we can reimagine them. But the series will also address the questions of language, belonging, restorative justice, knowledge production, and more. The specificity of this series is that the wonderful speakers that we will receive for each episode will be asked to formulate a recommendation of a concrete action that the House can implement in the upcoming years. At the end of the series, we will make a synthesis of all these recommendations and share a plan of action. I'm going to take this opportunity to present our great panelists today. On my left here, I have Karine Zeeman. Karine is an artist, curator, and scholar committed to critical engagement with colonial archives and collections, specifically those holding strands of Khoikhoi pasts. Her research aims to contribute to a radical reconsideration of colonial archives and museum collections, especially by assisting in finding ways to release their hold over our imaginations when we narrate the past, as well as how we might shape futures from it. Thank you so much for being here, Karine.
Thank you.
With me on stage, I also have the wonderful Rosé. Rosé is our curator for the Ties with South Africa exhibition that the House will be holding from the 6th of November onwards. She has worked with a lot of material from the House's archives and will be able to give us insights on their content and absences. Rosé holds a bachelor in anthropology from the University of Free State, South Africa, and she's currently completing her master's in museum and heritage studies here in the Netherlands. She's passionate about South African heritage and exploring alternative narratives, streams of narratives. She wants to contribute to empowering marginalized communities through engaging with heritage. Thank you so much for being here, Rosé. Online with us, we have Yumoke Sanwo. She's joining us live from Lagos, Nigeria, where she works and lives. Yumoke is a lens-based storyteller, placemaker, and cultural producer working within both 2D and 3D realms. Her arts and curations are located at the intersection of technology, innovation, materiality, and art. She delves into the spatial and temporal experiences of individuals and collectives, shedding light on the profound impact of colonial system within post-colonial societies. Her work has garnered recognition across the world in museums and film festivals in New York, Venice, Amsterdam, and London. Thank you so much for being with us online, Yumoke. And thank you. We also were supposed to have Stacey Links with us, but she's sick, so we wish her a speedy recovery. We might see her in other episodes of the series, but Stacey is a South African international relations scholar based here in the Netherlands. Hi, Stacey, if you're here. So thanks again to all of you for being here. whether you're online or in person. I'm still gonna hold the mic for a few more minutes to introduce you to today's topic. We're gathering to discuss archival absences in the colonial archive and think through how we can reimagine a radically different archival space where these absences might perhaps take a central stage. But next slide, please. The archives, archival absences, colonial archives, what are we talking about? There's a lot of things on my slide because we're talking about a lot of different things. I think it's important to define concepts. So if I take the Cambridge definition, dictionary definition of an archive, it is described as a collection of historical records relating to a place, organization, or family, or a place where historical records are kept. Traditionally, and according to the standards definitions, archives are perceived as rather objective, detached repository of data. Importantly though, archives are not merely receptacle of the past. Concepts of history themselves are shaped by archives. In many ways, archives shape our very vision of history. The absences, the issue of gaps and exclusion, as well as that of biases emanating from the organization that first built the archives and continue sustaining them today, come as particularly important here. For if our collective view of the past is widely incomplete, our understanding of the present is too. The Zuid-Afrikahuis holds a colonial archive. Its collection gathers numbers of administrative documents, personal exchanges, and photographs dating from the late 19th century to the mid-20th century. They're all tied to South Africa. As Sana Tanuri Karam puts it, the colonial archive suffers from systemic and targeted erasure of records in order to ensure the creation of a sanitized narrative of the colonial encounter. If we were to pay attention to the Zuid-Afrikahuis's archive deafening silences, what would we end up hearing? Several researchers and artists have built new methodologies to read through archival absences. Reading against the grain is one way to do it. Rather than looking at the document in the plainest way, scholars and artists can seek to inquire the material absences, the silences within it, and produce an alternative reading of the data. Reading along the grain can also be a powerful method. And Stoller, key author of the archival turn, has argued for this method, one of profound immersion. Through a close reading of the Dutch East Indies archives, she has revealed how colonial categories were produced by colonial administrators, how we can trace them through the archives and their permeation in our current times. She also speaks of the strange continuities of these colonial categories that were built, how they're still shaping our day-to-day societies. And she also used the very interesting concept of colonial toxicities, on which we might go back as we continue through this conversation. So in the same vein as Stoller here, we want to consider archival material and colonial archives differently, seeing the objects that compose it as active, generative substances with histories of their own. We will consider our archive silences and their underlying root causes. We will also explore such concepts as archival imaginaries, radical empathy, and the role of affects to help us rethink our archives and their futures. I will give a definition to all those concepts when we get to that part of the discussion. But first, let's focus on understanding absences. The public, whether it is online or in person, is more than welcome to ask any questions as we're talking together here. If we can make it participatory, it's amazing. So, and if you don't understand something or if you would like more precision, don't hesitate to ask. So yeah, let's get to it. We're gonna start by talking about archival absences, and then we're gonna try to rethink and reimagine them, the archives, and then we will go to the recommendations. So, I have to find myself in all these papers. Yeah. So, I have a first questions for my panelists. Um, whoever wants to start is welcome to start. Yumoke as well. But I'm going to ask you, how does like archival absence manifests in your respective fields, as well as in your respective work, or have manifested, and perhaps how you would define it yourself. Karine, José?
Just checking. Is this all right? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation and for this very productive conversation. And for me, the question around absences in the archive is so central to everything I do, because it really points to a moment in my, it's a personal, individual life where I wanted to find out more about my ancestor, and launched into the VOC archives. And what I found, even though I found a little bit there, was very limited and limiting, and extremely frustrating. So it very quickly became clear that in order to have a relationship with my ancestor, I needed to, in some way, grapple with and overcome this absence, which is then what led to a lot of, and I said it started as a personal thing, but it then led to a lot of scholarly and artistic work, in which I really try and think of other ways of engaging with the past, and kind of making visible absence, not trying to only feed back into the archive, but actually facing the fact that there's so much absence. And that's been very liberating in many ways. And even now, at present, as I'm working in a museum here in Europe, one of the things, for example, that is very commonly described in museal practice is the use of provenance research. Because provenance research is often employed as though it was going to solve all our problems. And it's very seldom that I hear the limits of provenance research being acknowledged, in the sense that to some degree we're working here also with archives, and so the same kind of grappling that has been done with archives have not necessarily been done in that kind of way. So I think I see myself a little bit as the what about absence flag waver, wading into every conversation, saying, but there's that what we're dealing with absence aren't in purely incidental or kind of small part of a fullness, that there's just is missing, but actually there's much more absence, and that the little bits that we have are what Vern Harris called slivers of slivers of slivers. And in that sense, I think just reconstellating things in terms of absence immediately also changes what we, how we might imagine what is possible to say about the past.
Um, for me, I think I encountered. For me, I think I encountered absences not as much in museums, because the richness of museums I only discovered when I came to Europe about a year ago. So for me, my journey in absence started in academia, where I saw kind of representation of the Black community and the white community in academia, in literature. But I didn't see that. So in South Africa, just for context, in South Africa, it was racialized a bit different, where you have three race categories plus your Asian and your Indian. So the third racial category is your colored people, which in literature is not very much acknowledged, as well as in the global West. It's not very much talked about, this identity group or this identity of people. So that's where I kind of started off with the journey of absences and seeing the gap in literature. And that kind of led me to the Netherlands on a journey to be like, okay, I want to make a museum on colored people, on the history of colored people, on the complexity of colored people, because it's a for me it's a group of people that are like nuanced in so many ways that it's a lot of conflict, but yet still not homogenization, harmonization in a way. So I found that beautiful, and I found that loss that the world doesn't know that in current day, but also in the past. And so working at the house kind of like put me face to face with that absences in the extent that it went to, but also in the extent that it went to make these different identities, to solidify these three racial identities in South Africa and to kind of split people and scatter them. So that's where I found myself in the archives and working in these absent presences, looking at what was there, what was erased, and what was remade, and then looking back at the process and seeing if you can fit something in new. I don't know. I guess I'm still in the process.
Just to ask you if you can like say a bit more about how you've seen them in our archives here in the Zuid-Afrikahuis, for it to be a bit more concrete for everyone what we're talking about when we talk about these archives. Yeah.
So within the archive of the house, from the 19th century, we see a lot of material, or not even from the 19th century, even art at the time. You see a lot of when the Cape was discovered. You see a lot of material on Jan van Riebeeck, on the founders of South Africa, but you don't see a lot of the stories of the people that were there. You have one or two names throughout history, but you don't see the groups of people that would have displaced. A lot of the exhibition that I'm working in and working with is kind of to shed light that the way history has been written down here is a history that people have been living through like thousands of years before we even started documenting things like the Groot Trek, before before trade was what the VOC and the VIC made it. Now there was already forms of trade, there was already forms of communication. So I'm looking at those things and how people were, so those missing links, trying to find out who documented it, who's speaking on it, how are they speaking on it, because I think how they're speaking on it is super important as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jose. Maybe Yumoka?
Thank you very much, Nasima. I think for me, my first, I would say, conscious encountering of absences in archives is when I was working on a particular project in 2000. It was a project around scarification, and I'd interviewed one of my subjects, on the photography project, and he was 120 years old. And he was trying, so when he told me he was 120 years old, he shocked me, because I was like, okay, how do we clarify, your age, So he then made reference to the king, of his village at the time, and also certain specific events which took place, in and around him at the time. So I then went on to the National Archive just to try and uncover, a little bit of history. And then I think what came about from that experience for me is this idea that, the way that I would say, because I'm Yoruba, so I'm speaking specifically to Yoruba tribe, the way that, the experience is always often around events, and also around certain things and certain relations. So I realized that if a lot of how we're experiencing memory is through this methodology, how come our archives aren't represented using this format that was very natural to the way that people engaged memory? So that was the first thing that actually struck me in terms of how archives are specified and also categorized as well. And then going further on, into kind of, I think going a little bit back actually into, the World Wide Web, and this idea of representation as well also came to the fore for me, in the sense that, family where oral history was the norm, and my mother or my grandmother would tell stories about our ancestors, in a way that it was very relatable. And we also had ways of sort of passing on stories as well, which was really very simple and very relatable and so on. But then going on and having my first experience with the World Wide Web in 2000, I realized that the representation of Africans on that particular, space didn't represent my lived experiences, so to speak. And it was again kind of like trying to figure out, okay, so who are the people putting together these histories, so to speak, and how are they sort of making, their categorizations, and how does that represent, the people, the subjects in which that they're categorizing. So I think that's kind of like on a personal note of how I began to kind of become a lot more critical about archives. More importantly, I think my criticality of it really in a way that I want to kind of dismiss what exists in archives, but again, is to kind of think about creating sort of methodologies in how to actually engage them in a way that is more accessible, because I realized that memory in itself, when you think about how indigenous societies experience memory, it's a very public venture, where many different people come together and kind of decide on certain things that happened in a particular period, and it's sort of like a collective endeavor. So how do you sort of take this methodology into the construct of archives is possibly some of the things that got me thinking in terms of ways to shape the format, its engagement, and so on going forward.
Thank you so much, Yumoke. You raise a lot of really interesting points, and you actually, like, the way you seem to think of archives in the past and collective memory, like what you said about how unnatural certain archival institution felt, like you're already opening the bounds of what an archive, the boundaries of what the archives can be. So that's super interesting. And also you raised the question of who is putting together our histories, and that's also very interesting, because people are being dispossessed from their own pasts. It raises further questions, right? And you all sort of spoke about how these absences have personally affected you. But I'm gonna ask you if you can maybe go in more depth into how you felt when you've witnessed that your history was not necessarily represented, or was very poorly represented, or negatively represented.
I think that what I felt was a sense of, dislocation, in the sense that there was no correlation between my lived experiences and what was being represented. So it was kind of like this sense of dislocation, and then again, I looked at it, and I also, I mean, looking at some of, for example, the representation of scarification within the archive in itself, it lacked a lot of detail and a lot of context as well. So in essence, it's to kind of start thinking about, okay, this showed that whoever wrote about this particular subject had very little knowledge about it. And also, in essence, it then brings up, as well.
Yeah, I think that is very telling about a lot of like what you find in archival material, that you see like small things that I've picked up while looking at the house's archival material. Like some things are misspelled, like the way things are described or used or talked about. I'm like, but wait, is this like the correct way or phrase to say it? And then many a times I would like go back and find, okay, this is what actually is said, as you said. but for uh for me, it's a mixed feeling because I haven't really made contact with a lot of colored literature or literature about colored people if it's not within the sense of black and white and South Africa within apartheid. And growing up in middle class South Africa, you are not traditionally told to talk or have feelings about like things like politics, things like literature, which is official. You are part of the system. So for me, going to university and going like to the next step, so to say, in my family line, it's it's already revolutionary. And then to come into a space and to see that I'm not represented, or if I am represented, it is as a threat or as a violent person, which is confronting to me myself. But it's also something that is like, but this is not true. And you kind of struggle to find where to find the truth about yourself. So it's very dislocating and alienating from the academic space, but also in the world and how you move. So yeah.
Thank you for that. That's, yeah, I can definitely also relate to what you're saying. I think for me, the overwhelming emotion is deep melancholia. And I think part of the reason for that is that it feels as though, in order to speak about the past or make any claims based on the past in the present, requires some sort of ability to identify a fact from the archival record. And in the absence of that, it becomes very difficult to speak into the present. So on the one hand, it's that continuity with the past, but at the same time, it is what it doesn't allow one to do in the present. And a very good example of this is a long battle that I've been involved with. But so in Cape Town, there's a piece of land that developer is developing, despite much contestation from a number of Kwekwe groups, including the Korangakona, whom I'm a part of. And one of the difficulties in that battle has been the fact that the contestation about, what happened on this piece of land, because the way that these claims are set up is that somebody needs to be able to either make, like I said, draw from a particular record to say this is the exact spot at which XYZ happened and therefore this land means something. The kinds of intergenerational associations with the land, ways in which it's been used, and what that land has come to signify in the present bears no legal weight. So it becomes impossible to make those claims based in that way. So I think that sadness and that sense of dispossession, of which you also spoke beautifully, is not only relating to the past, but it becomes an impossibility to enunciate in a way that is meaningful and effective in the present as well.
Just to follow up on what I found in the physical archive is that I spent a lot of time looking at like maps and old pictures, and what I saw that the way homelands, and if you talk about something as political in South Africa as like land struggles and land rights, that is something that's constantly moving, and the way land was perceived at that time is different. But it doesn't mean that the violence of like erasing that archive or renaming something doesn't stop there. It still has been reborn, and it still like causes this large dispossession and lostness, not just within the past or within apartheid, but currently still you still have like this large sense of dislocatedness, or you have, I don't know if you know, in South Africa currently there's like, it's a lost nation. You're looking for a lost nation in the Kuringa people. Yeah. So, and this is like what I've seen in the archive. This is I don't know if it's conscious, but you can see it moving from time to time, and how these names got taken out and replaced by something else. And that's, I feel, part of creating an absence, rewriting and unwriting a story.
That might be one of the fundamental absences. I mean, one of the foundational, like, yeah. Thank you so much for these points, which are extremely relevant. And that's a perfect transition to a question I wanted to ask you, because I do think that I hope we're being clear enough about what we're talking about, and that our speakers can also make our audiences feel that it's a very urgent topic. Like, archives also matters because they shape our present. And you guys, like, you gave this really important example of what is happening right now in South Africa, and the claims being made on lands and not having these written records to be able to show them to courts or other institutions. So my question is, why do you think archives matter, but also how do they shape our present, and the ways in which we live in a world shaped by a past that is misunderstood? Like, if you can go in more depth on that sort of, and why it's thus urgent to rethink them, because that's what we're going to do afterwards. Thank you.
I want to make reference to a fantastic South African scholar that you might know already, but if not, I think might be interesting to you. Somebody called June Bum, who wrote a book recently. I think it was published about a year or two ago. It's called Elsie Told Me. And she has done some fantastic work to look at the flats, the kinds of embedded knowledges about, from medicine to, from kind of histories to all kinds of folkloric things, etc., etc. And the main premise of the book, I think, is that it is a fight against what she refers to as an extinction narrative. So with Kwekwe people and Kham people and more, there's this idea that, people were pretty much wiped out. So it's also a group of people very much relegated to history. And once you say that, it's just in the past, you don't have to, in a sense, deal with the contemporaneous issues. This happens through colonialism, is massively compounded during apartheid. But in contemporary South Africa also, because of this extinction narrative seems to have taken hold quite strongly. So archives matter in that sense, for me a great deal, not in order to say, okay, well, because this extinction narrative is to large degree brought to, enunciated through archives, but to try and say, again, recast it, or to look at them or read them differently. We spoke earlier about Stoller's reading along the grain, and I think that for me is to say, okay, if we take archives to be but a something of an indication, but that we also, as Junbam makes very apparent, the depth of other forms of historical record that exists, or connection with the past, that some might refer to as a kind of archive. That's fine, but that we expand this notion of where might we find the sediments of generations upon generations of lived life in spaces, and of intersubjective ways that they continue to exist.
I think expanding the archive is like a beautiful narrative, a beautiful way to like talk about it, because there's different forms of archives, especially in these like erased communities, or so to say erased groups of people. But I think archive is like your living memory, even though we put it in a static place. The way archives are done in the West, in my opinion, is very static, because you have it written down, you have it put in a file, put in a box somewhere, and now it's like this forever. But we're not talking with the archive isn't that much expanded to like living memory, your memory of, because your relatives also have an archive, the story that's been told to you about yourself is part of an archive. Like, I feel like growing up, I we didn't really talk much about who we are, what we came, or where we came from, unless it was in face of adversity and you needed to claim an identity. And then it was either an identity was placed upon you, or you were told by someone else, this is how you should be, and then that's it. That doesn't come from just in the minute, split second. That is from a history of something. So for me, the homogenization of colored people across South Africa is also an archival act. And putting all of these people together might have been a colonial product, but it traces back to a group of people that have specific features. If you look at how people describe colored people, it's not any people. It's a group of people that have specific features. It's a group of people that speak a specific way. And this can be traced to, funny enough, literature. If you read a few things, you'll see in your everyday colored slang words, in the way that we address or in the way that we linger our tones. You can trace it back to, oh, but you might be Griqua, or you might be Griquakam, and all of these things just in the lingo. And for that reason, an archive is important, because it really informs your present and it projects to how your future would be, even if it's unconscious.
Yumaka, if you want to say something.
Thank you very much, Rosie, for that. For me, I feel that, archives, instigate the present because it helps us to kind of look at what aspect of the past we're bringing forward to the present and what aspects of it we need to forget. I think that one of the things that, I have taken from the indigenous approach to memory is this idea that remembering is as important as also forgetting as well. And that also determining, which aspects of the history that one needs to let go of and which aspect one needs to bring, forward. Going by what Rosie just said, archives as they currently exist are static spaces in which, it doesn't allow for much development beyond how it exists. And therefore, it is then shaping the narrative of the present in the sense that, people, and I'll give an example, in Nigeria, for example, history was banned, or actually taken out of the curriculum at some point, in the last couple of years. And the reason is that, we have certain aspects of our history that is in contention, and that therefore is instigating, certain situations on ground. So in order to mitigate that, they felt that the most expedient thing to do was to sort of remove sort of history from the curriculum. So meaning that, nobody's even investigating the archives in itself, or there's no need to even go back into the archives. So in my view, I feel that in the present, archives are ways whereby we can begin to shape a different future because of the importance of how we navigate our history. And I feel that in order to do that, one needs to start to develop a very interesting approach in sort of dealing, with some of the absences, in the archive.
Thank you so much, Yumaka. Thank you. Thanks to all the speakers. You're making wonderful points. I wanted to quickly go back to how you, Jose, earlier said how you felt when you worked through the archives and the alienation, the feeling of being misrepresented as well. And I personally think that it can be generative as well, because it's like sometimes the anger you feel, or that's basically the sometimes, what really motivates me to do what I do. And I don't know if it also motivates you, and to try to spark some form of change, right? It's also that feeling that there's something wrong there. And I wanted to add that little counterbalance to these negative emotions. But you also rose the point of the archives being such static spaces, and that brings me to trying to reimagine them. And to do that, I kind of want to put to the forefront certain concepts that can be helpful for us as a starting point for this second part of our conversation. Next slide, please, Jamie. All good. But the two concepts that I want to sort of bring to the forefront are archival imaginaries and radical empathy. And in some way, Jose, you touched upon also archival imaginaries, and you all did actually, when saying that we carry our archives with us, or Yumoke also raised that point, like the way of narrating stories of the past collectively and doing that in group. So these are perhaps new ways that we can create archives in the present. Next slide. Yes, and next one again. Perfect, thank you. So yeah, imagination in general is very central to all forms of agency. That's what Arjun Appadurai said. I don't know if you know the author, he's an anthropologist. Appadurai argues that collective imagination creates imagined words, that is, the multiple words that are constituted by the historically situated imaginations of persons and groups spread across the globe. How I understand it is that we carry with us constantly different collective imaginations, and that they shape our understanding of the past, present, and future. Archival imaginaries have been defined in very academic terms as the dynamic way in which communities creatively and collectively re-envision the future through archival interventions in representations of the shared past. Through the archival imaginary, the past becomes a lens to the future. The future is rooted in that which precedes it. Through the archival imaginary, the future can be conceived through kernels of what was possible in the past. Again, in my understanding of such a definition, it's archival imaginaries are these collective narrative about the past that we carry and that we can we can use as resources to fill the gaps in the archives and build new ones. That's how I understand it. Maybe you understand it differently. I'm also quickly going to present radical empathy and what it is. So there's two authors, notably Caswell and Seafor, that worked a lot on it. And they've defined radical empathy as a learned process of direct and deep connections between the self and another that emphasizes human commonality through thinking and feeling into the minds of other. They note, an archival approach marked by radical empathy would require archives to make survivors and implicated communities not just the target groups of users, but central focal points in all aspects of the archival endeavor, from appraisal to description to provision of access. So I think this is very dense, but we have two starting points of how we can reimagine our archival space and spaces. So my first question is, well, going to be very straightforward. Building up on those concepts, how do you think we can change the way we think of archives? Yeah, that's the start.
So with the definitions, wait, a lot is going through my mind right now. So if we're gonna start at what is archive and how you have experienced archives, in the traditional sense, it is something that you find about the past that can include you, but most of the time should not include you because you're just a normal person. Normal people are not in archives. Archival material, archival material. That's the impression we have, that archives are kept on people that are important and on big historical figures. One, and then two, looking at the house's archive and what has been taken in here, I think it goes more towards the injustice of what it was, and that the pictures taken or the material gathered was more towards the point of getting material from them instead of speaking to them and with them. So I really like your concept of radical empathy, because it brings subjectivity to the the content of the archive. It brings not just like a random face or colored people sitting in this, black people in their native. So it brings like that subjectivity of saying, this is these people, this is what is happening, this is why they are there. And then I don't think that archival material in images are as dynamic as it is portrayed to be, in that it can allude to a future that may be different. If we're talking about wars and discrimination and disadvantages, perhaps. But as it is, the documented archival, I don't think so. And then I want to talk about archival material that is not your like traditional archiving, and that is sitting in a community, sitting between people and listening to stories, working on like your common, like in anthropology we have a collective memory, working in the collective memory, seeing what people remember about that. There I've learned like a lot more than I could have ever learned on a book when reading about these people or understanding. And there you, in process of describing collective memory, you are doing intense things that would require years in academia in a few hours with a few people, because there you construct the memory together, but you also break down a few things. You do kind of like an active forgetting while still remembering of what is good and what is bad. And so you don't just talk about or reminisce, but you also build a community and you build new bonds from this imagined community or imagined archive, collective memory that you're sitting with in that moment.
Oh, beautiful. What I will, I'm not sure that I think of the archive in such a static manner. Maybe I think it would like us to think like that. I think it's been definitely cast like that, to say, oh yes, this record, it exists, we can go back and so on. But if we look at how archives are used, and then quite a few interesting examples, then a lot of the time they're not that organized, they're not that static, they are not the thing that they pretend to be. So somehow we've all been duped into thinking of like this about archives, when in fact, in my experience, they don't actually really function like that. So one of the ways for me is to actually embrace this chaoticness in a sense, because it loosens some of the kind of reified authority of it. So we say, we imagine that authority much decentralized and dispersed in terms of exactly these kinds of conversations, as you were saying. So for me, that's already, so recasting archive would even take recasting even that notion. And as concerns the empathy, I was quite moved now by what you were saying about anger as an activating emotion. I completely agree with this, and I think what it reminded me of that when I went into the archive and I was looking at my ancestors. So there's, in the archives, she was presented, or in the VOC records at least, she's very much presented as, unchristian and like, this is a bad person, right? So there's this narrative of that, and she was a trickster and she told lies and blah blah blah. That's the one narrative. And then subsequently, in kind of the 1990s moment in South Africa, where there's this massive reconsideration of histories and so on, and then she emerges as this victim. So in other words, somebody that was, her entire life was dominated, by colonialism and the Dutch. And both of these positions are deeply unsatisfying. It's not only the she was a bad person narrative, which is, very upsetting, of course. And so one of the things that I started doing was to start reading what, like you would read an untrustworthy narrator in a fiction, when the narrator tells you something, but you know that you can't believe them. And suddenly there's this figure emerged that was really good at, understood what the Dutch wanted, understood what other Queque groups wanted, was really good at positioning herself in this space, and she achieved quite a great deal of that. Which, I mean, ultimately it ends really badly for her. But it's not just a simple trajectory of saying the Dutch arrive, there's this disintegration. And I think something about radical empathy has to do with affording those that we might not be able to see fully through the archival record more agency than is available either in the record itself or in these kinds of reconstructive gestures where there's a simple tale of being told and so on. But because it's through that agency that we, the kinds of stories that you're talking about start to be able to be told.
You, Moke?
Thank you very much, Rosie and Karine. I think first of all, the idea of radical empathy to me will be, the opportunity to expand, the target audience a little bit more. And by this expansion, it is also kind of like giving, as Karine has said, the audience, a little bit more agency in also being part of shaping the new narrative, for some of these subjectivities. I think that that way, there's a possibility. It's not necessarily to recaption, some of these narratives, but in essence to add an additional note to them in a way that it allows for new information to be included in the furthering knowledge, which I think would be a very interesting.
Jamie? Yeah? Okay, I continue. Sorry, Yumoke, I hope we're gonna see you soon. But still, you all, again, raised amazing points. And, well, we're moving sort of towards the practical as well, because I think... Yeah, please, Yumoke, finish. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. I didn't realize I was off. I kept on talking. Where did you lose me?
I'm sorry, I'm a bit confused myself, but...
Opening up new theories and radical empathy being for...
Yeah, exactly. You just started speaking about radical empathy.
Yeah, so I was trying to speak about radical empathy in the sense that, once you open up the target audience, and then also involving, many different aspects of that audience as well. So from the subject to the archivist in itself, becomes some sort of player in the whole narrative as well, in the sense that their own subjectivities would also kind of orchestrate, what the interpretation of the archive. So I feel that in a way there should be an allowance of, I'm not saying a recaptioning or reframing of archives, but in essence, the ability to add notes to them that accommodate, all of the subjectivities and also shows where they're coming from as well. I think would probably give a more robust construct, of what is present in the archive.
And perhaps one last question before we move to the little recommendations. Like, what about the archives that we're creating right now? Because we do have an active power on them. We have also power to our agency to a certain, we can have agency to a certain extent on these institutional archives that we all have in mind. But I mean, those that we're creating now for future generations, how should we build them and think through them? I think they're extremely important. You talked about the erasure of certain people, their disappearance, so that comes as even more important to create things now. How should we create them, and who should we? Maybe not who necessarily, but yeah, how, and who if you want.
That's a tough one. So archiving and counter archiving and all of these strategies have, often used by oppressed groups in order to speak back to kind of dominant political narratives. And again, super important. It's also, I think, a way in which to expand the references, in a sense, to say that there's this depth and richness of life that is being sidelined in particular ways that can in some way be held in the counter archive. So I would agree that it's important. I would, going back to Anne Stoler that you mentioned earlier, I think what is really interesting also about a lot of her work is that it shows how some of the VOC archives that she looks at were brought about in order to address some of the insecurities and uncertainties that existed. So it was these were ways in which to create categories. So I think it would be that people who engage in those kind of counter archival projects can speak to this much more. But I think to focus on that is to say that this is an act of creation. This is an act of instantiation. This is an act that you will never have the fullest, most complete archive. You will not have it. So take political decisions about what gets privileged. And this does not only mean, which stories get privileged, but what media, what forms, how does it, is it open? Who owns it? What are the parameters of ownership and usage that are instantiated alongside this archive, so that it's, that it can suit the agenda for which it is assembled, that it doesn't, in a sense, simply reproduce those agendas that were instituted via colonial archives, which we understand through work of people like Stoler, came about not for benign reasons.
I think like opening the archive and how to create archives and what we're doing with archives has been a hot conversation in the Netherlands, to a point where provenance was so important. I just want to go back to that. I love provenance. Sorry. To a point where provenance is so important, because who got it, under what circumstances, also tells you a lot about what an object is and why it is like in someone's possession, or why they had interest to it. There is a particular picture that I became obsessed with in the archive of a singer, Gladys Zitai. I've never heard of her. I asked a few people, they were all like, we don't know her, but someone in the house found her very important, and so important enough to take a picture in South Africa, send it all the way to the Netherlands, and then that was it. It's kind of this name that nobody knows, and this is the only name of a person of color in the archive. So that's something very important, and so it's something to do with the past in the present that we now can put shape to, we can put form to. So I do think that opening the narrative, and as Imonka said, opening the narrative, creating space for alternative narratives to exist or coexist, because a lot of the work that I'm doing in the exhibition is looking at how different narratives can coexist instead of having to alienate each other, because at the end we are like a myriad of multitudes of differences. So yeah, how to open it, how to have different narratives sitting like next to each other, side by side. What is important to forget and what is important to remember? who are we remembering and who are we forgetting and why is it important? I think if we go to those central questions and move from there and look at the reason why we are re-remembering Krutoa, for example, looking at what her legacy is in the Netherlands but also in South Africa, and putting it into context of the living environment or the lived environment of South Africa, looking at the stories people are told, the oral histories that are being carried on about like big figures in South Africa, like your Krutoa, like your Sarki Bartman. Where are those people? Where are their people? Are they still being claimed? How is their legacies being used? So it's kind of that space where you can ask a lot of questions and not necessarily find the answers, but find a way to connect yourself. So it can be a method in connecting. And then my last point is I feel like we're in part of the world where we are hyper conscious of our subjectivity, but also of our liminality, so how limited our life is. So creating an archive and wanting to be part of it, it's kind of the work that we are already doing is already part of an archive. Yeah, I don't know, that was very deep.
We love deep. Yumoka? I think we again have a little problem with Yumoka. Yeah, it's the issue. Yeah, it's okay. Thank you so much to the both of you. I'm gonna move to the recommendation part simply because it's almost 6. But I would love for us to speak longer about reimagining the archives. So would you have in a few sentences an idea whether it is collaboration? I mean, it can be rooted in so many different things of what we could do here as an institution to shape our archives differently, colonial archives and perhaps the new we will build. Oh, Yumaka, can you put your microphone on? But I think she's stuck. If you can write to her in the chat. Yeah? Well, okay, I'm gonna let you speak, guys, for the recommendations. Thank you so much. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Hybrid. Ah. Okay.
I think as a recommendation, it's always that difficult question that comes back to coloniality as to how do we do restitution, what do we do with retribution, like it's all of these big questions. But I've been reading a lot of like main narratives and counter narratives, but also regional text. And I struggle to find the balance between the main narrative and the counter narrative in the archive, but also with myself, because I always ask the question, am I creating for myself to be part of a different thought against the West? Or am I creating within the West? And if I am creating within the West, how do I go about that? Do I go about undoing it? Do I go about telling a different story? So I think that is one way to approach it. From literature, what I've seen is there's a lot of people that has written counter to like mainstream academia, mainstream history, and that is one way of doing it. But I believe the beauty in it would be to find the bridge, building bridges, building bridges and finding a bridge and seeing how these two narratives can exist together, how you can have your westernized colonial history but still include the minority history and how they can majority how they can collaborate or make something richer. Yeah.
your concrete recommendation would be including more people's voices within our archives. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's crucial. I would definitely agree with that. I'm thinking in terms of thick annotations. There's all kinds of ways in which one can have voices speaking in a pluralistic way in the archive actually is present. So when a researcher walks in, it is not the so that the archival horizon isn't drawn at a very particular point, and then it doesn't include the researchers that are working with it today and so on. That becomes actually co-opted into the archives. I think is very powerful. And another related strategy I think is very good is to really go quite radical with in terms of or to be quite radical in terms of making the archive available to everybody everywhere around the world, making connections to other projects, making collaborating, especially with South African institutions. I can't emphasize how stark the difference between resources here and resources in South Africa are. There are so many institutions that have the expertise, that have the ideas and would love to do some of this work, but then it remains kind of centered in the Netherlands. It's not only the Netherlands, but it is definitely also the Netherlands. So in that sense, I think that it is like when we say open the archives, I think that there's more than just saying, oh, everybody's free to come and peruse our archives. Oh, why don't they come? But rather to say, how do we actively walk these archives out and produce these connections and make these, I think, in spaces where that is really need, where there's not this kind of super abundance of resources. And I think to take the notion, to sum this up for me is a kind of really to take the notion of an archival commons seriously. And I think it's in that sense that it becomes not, the archive is not a static thing. It is not something that somebody has to travel and get a visa for in order to visit or to be attached to an institution to use. But the kinds of connections that become available once there's an archival commons that a number of institutions partake in is actually such a profound way in which to start telling stories that we have no idea actually can be told at this stage.
Thank you so much. That's a really good idea. Yumoka, I don't know what you caught of the conversation, but because time is moving, I moved to the recommendation part, whether you had any concrete recommendation that the house, how it should deal with its archive now, to and in the future. Is that a clear question? Probably not.
Yes, it is,
Cool.
Nasima. I think I'd actually mentioned that, while I was answering the second question, which is the idea of opening it up, to also expand the target audience. I think that's one way, in essence, to bring other people, into this conversation of engaging as well as reinterpreting or giving archives new definition in the present for the future. There's also the possibility as well in this new engagement coexist side by side, with old interpretations of it, in a way that it can also increase further dialogues, on how to expand, the interpretation of archives in the future. But more importantly, I feel that in essence, there has to be ways to bring a lot more storytelling into our archives are presented, that our lives are pretty much situated around stories. And going by what Karine had said, in essence, sometimes archives can be disjointed, but in essence, to create some sort of mapping that is also fashioned in a way that is aching towards telling stories about the past in a way that is a bit more relatable, also taking it away from from sort of like the academic dimension to a more relatable dimension, in that more people can look at archives as ways to encounter their histories, and also a way, for them to also kind of, in a way, think about how they're also creating the archives of the future to how they're, documenting and so on.
Thank you so much, Yumoka. So we do have a few concrete ways to move forward. One of them is, yes, to include more storytelling into our archives. I'm already like imagining like some sort of project that we could lead together, maybe with communities in South Africa, where we maybe create, I don't know, a website or something together that tells different stories of the Dutch in South Africa, or, I mean, the links between the two places, but also of South Africa itself, of course. And you also mentioned archives of the commons, and I really like that. Commons archives. Again, more collaboration, contacting more institutions, and together creating something where people all around the globe can use as a resource. That's also great. So I invite everybody here to check archives, to check their own histories, perhaps. And I also wanted to ask you if you guys had any questions. Any question is welcome. Yeah? And it can be aimed at someone or like a speaker or everybody. Yeah? You just will get a microphone in a second. And if you can give your name also, it's nice.
Hi, is it working?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, my name's Emma. This is directed at everyone. But so in relation to how archives could be restructured to be less static, how, and I think you've all kind of touched on the privileging of written over oral within archival work. How could more oral histories be included? Like, for example, could they be recorded, but then does the recording of an oral story then take away from its dynamic nature? Like, how could you work around this?
Very interesting. Does someone want to first respond? My intuition would be that, yes, they could be recorded and they would remain, and perhaps also we could lead some sort of programs, or just as much as we can record them, we can try to carry values that lead to the continuation of these traditions. And I think both can go hand in hand, like the recording and making sure that new generations keep on carrying that tradition.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking as well. So I think the record is a sliver of a sliver of a sliver of how it lives, absolutely. So I think I'm thinking of a project, for example, that took place in Klein Willem for a number of years, in which stories that had existed for hundreds of years and kind of went into a colonial archive, then were brought out again, and there was this workshopped into kind of collectively with learners and so on, so that the stories have a new life as well. So I think it's not about capturing the stories like a butterfly and putting it into a vitrine, but rather to have a whole colony of butterflies, and having the butterflies live their lives in a way that yeah.
That's a really nice image.
Yeah, that really is beautiful. In the Netherlands, there is a few archival houses that do like record, make point of recording oral histories, and I know of a few projects as well, happening across the world where they are centering oral history, and you have your smaller museums that center oral history. There's one museum I worked with in my internship in Brazil, Multatuli. It's basically just a house with a bunch of things, no labels, no anything formal text. You have to go in there with a guide. And I think that's beautiful because then you implore someone from the community to come tell something about this museum or this house and why it is significant for them. So you have things like that, and currently they're working on digitalizing it so that it's available for everyone. So I think recording it does have its values in that you could pick it up later, reproduce it, have something different come out of it, compose it in a different way. But I also think there's a beauty in being in a space and being in a conversation. So like having more institutions or programs where people come in and tell their own story, and walk throughout so you can get to know the people, that brings a sense of humanity and less digital static kind of thing, because it's a one person story that they're telling from the specific angle and affect that they're feeling in that day that can't really be reproduced.
Yumoka, did you hear the question well?
Not quite. I didn't quite get the question.
So
Do you mind repeating?
it was about recording oral histories and whether these would take away from the very essence, if I may say, of an oral history, the fact from its dynamic nature, the fact of recording them. And should we do that? Would it be a nice strategy, was sort of the question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it in my view, it's going to be a great strategy to sort of explore oral history. My apologies, my dog is barking here because he wants to go out. So I'm sorry about that. Yeah. So, but I think that more importantly as well, I think that having maybe shifting the perspective in the storytelling can also be a very interesting methodology to use the oral history to achieve. By this, I mean that a lot of the material in the archives is a colonial archive, so it comes from a very colonial point of view or colonial perspective. So in essence, it would be very interesting to also have indigenous people also kind of give a very their own perspective through storytelling of certain contextual elements that was missing, and also bringing that to the fore, through this very interesting approach.
Thank you so much, Yumoka. Thank you so much, Emma, for your question. It was a really good question. Do we have any other questions? Maybe on the chat online? Nope. In person? Or remarks? No. Okay, so I wrap up. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for having been here. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and we will see you for the next episode of the series. Thank you so much, Yumoka.
Thank you so much,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ladies.
Thank you, Rosie. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. All right.